What's up, YouTube? Today I want to talk about kick drum dynamics processing. So these techniques that I'm going to talk about aren't specific to kick drums. You can use them on snares or anything. I just want to talk about the kind of basics behind drum dynamics processing that I use to get my drums to sound as good as they can be. So there's a couple of things that I've picked up analyzing a lot of beginner productions and mixes that I want to talk about today. One of them is that often one of the main issues that people have when they're not happy with their kick drums is that there's a pretty big imbalance between the volume of the transient and the volume of the body. That tends to be the main issue that we're dealing with. You know, once people can create the sound that they're happy with, the dynamics tends to be the next big thing that producers struggle with. So I want to talk about a couple of reasons why I see this kind of issue crop up quite a bit, the kind of imbalance. And I also want to talk about a couple of ideas that you can use to fix those, or how to be aware of the waveform and, you know, while you're actually creating the sound. I guess the major issue that I see most of the time is from like either overcompression or bad dynamics processing or EQing, which can create all sorts of other sort of issues for dynamics in a low frequency drum sound. So the first example that I want to use is something that you often see in tutorials, mixing tutorials and stuff. They'll say, do a low cut on the kick to remove rumble or all sorts of stuff like that. While that may apply if you have like an acoustic drum kit that you've recorded where the mics themselves may actually be picking up rumble, if you're dealing with synthesized kick drums, it's something that's probably going to actually cause you more issues. Reason being is that because you're now altering the low frequencies, what it does is it reduces the volume of the tail of the kick drum, thus altering the dynamics. So here I've set up a simple EQ, just low cutting. We can observe this kind of change in the audio here in an oscilloscope, but we can also just render it out and have a look at what the audio looks like. So if we have a look here, you'll notice that without the EQ, we've got a nice full transient and body. They're roughly the same amplitude. We have a nice full transient and full body. They're roughly the same amplitude. And when we enable the EQ, you'll notice that we immediately lose a lot of the tail of the kick drum. That's obviously because we're reducing the low frequencies. But there could also be all sorts of other kind of phasing things that EQs do that are causing these kinds of issues. And like I said, when we have the ability to synthesize a kick drum, or we're choosing a synthesized kick drum that kind of sounds much cleaner than a recorded one, we don't necessarily have to remove that rumble. So in my opinion, the low cut thing tends to cause more issues than it's worth. That's not saying don't EQ entirely. We can still use kind of high frequency cuts to shape things a little bit, but you'll see that these little adjustments here tend to throw the dynamics off quite a lot. So I would say be very kind of clinical with these kind of EQ movements if you are going to do them. Let's apply that low cut, let's bounce. And you see now like the body of the kick drum is now a little bit reduced in terms of the actual transient. So sometimes it's not such a bad thing, but sometimes it can really throw off like the rest of the dynamics processing. So another thing that tends to cause this kind of issue that I've picked up is compression. Because compression has an envelope, it has an attack and a release time, those envelopes tend to work more on the envelopes of your sound than you actually want them to. So I would say a compressor is less of like a compressor, like we think of it like squashing down the sounds. And it's actually more of a transient shaper. And I want to show you why, you know, in the actual resulting sound, you know, immediately as we enable it, you'll see that it turns that transient up a little bit and it reduces the kind of body and tail, which is kind of counterproductive to what we want. And that kind of attack shape over there is governed by this attack time here. You'll see as you turn it up, it kind of like curves it out a little bit more. And the release time also changes like the kind of shape of the body here. And so when these settings are applied in the extremes, like too much threshold and too much ratio, it tends to do the opposite effect. of what we actually want to do to the kick drum. What I'll do is bounce this out just so you can get an exact representation in the actual waveform. So do you see how it's really boosted that transient of the waveform as opposed to kind of squashing it down, which is what we kind of think a compressor would actually do. So the reason that this is important is that if we have a look at the actual waveform on like a proper visualizer, sometimes you'll notice some DAWs don't give you like the full effect. They kind of sum the stereo channels or they average them or something, so they don't give you the full effect. So I definitely recommend like a high quality waveform analyzer for this kind of thing. This one I'm using is Ocelos Megascope, but there's various others that you can use. If you set it to just monitor the left or the right, you can actually, it gives you a better reading of the dB. I'm not quite sure why. It's obviously got something to do with the window size and stuff. Regardless, if we have a look at the transient here, you'll notice that it's peaking at around 0 or dB or above, actually. So the transient already is going to cause issues. It's going to cause clipping unless we limit it in a master or mix chain. If we do that, that's going to then adjust, you know, how I was showing you. It's going to actually change the waveform, not only of this sound, but of any other sounds that are going through that same processing. If it's a mix bus and you've got like a bass sound and they're nicely mixed together, using sloppy compression or limiting on the sound to fix just the one sound is going to cause issues on both sounds. Does that make sense? So just being aware of this kind of thing is powerful. So if we observe, like the peak level here is around minus 10 dB, the peak of the body, where this is over 0. So we've got this variance of about 10 dBs. And we actually, like, the transient isn't really the important part of the kick drum. The important part, in my opinion, is that body, is that nice thumpy body. So we're already doing this kick a disservice by peaking the transient through above 0 dB and then allowing the body to be so quiet. So often, I know myself, I often say like, oh, when you're mixing, it's good to have a sort of set of numbers to start from and then to kind of build from that. So I say, for example, put your kick at minus 12, bass at minus 12, peak, percussion's a little bit, you know, like there's certain numbers that I will say in tutorials. And then if the peak of this kick drum is already peaking at 0, if we look at a meter here, what we're going to do to get minus 12 is we're going to turn this down, right? In fact, what I want to do is I want to do it with a tool here before, just so I can show you on a Ocelos Megascope what's happening. Now, the body of this kick drum is like minus 22 dBs, which is basically inaudible in a full mix, you know? So, anyway, enough of the explanation as to why. Let's talk about some of the ways in which you can fix this. So we observed that the kind of peak of that body was minus 10. So if we apply a clipper, which is essentially similar to a compressor or a limiter, but it has no envelope, it's instantaneous, it just cuts the signal above that. And in fact, I can show you using something like Kazrog K-Clip, which is my favorite clipper, but there are, like I said, various free alternatives to this. If we just start to reduce this threshold over here, the moment it goes above that, where we saw it peaking, it's going to just square off that waveform, boom, entirely. And so this squared off waveform is very audible with a low frequency waveform, but not so much with high frequency waveforms. In fact, sometimes they can liven up high frequency waveforms and actually give you what sounds louder, but reads at a lower peak volume. How do we do this without completely destroying and distorting the kick drum? Also want to note that now the clipper is in hard clip mode, so it's basically just completely cutting off the waveform, but there is soft clippers that will kind of like round off the edges a little bit. For example, like here, we've set soften on. Thing with these though is you've got to be a little bit careful because they have this kind of like wiggle room. Do you know what I mean? Here, for example, the amount of wiggle room here is about 2 to 3 dBs, right? But that's just this. So you have to really know the clipper if you're going to start messing with the soften. So anyway, the idea here is to set the threshold at this body's peak or just above. So remember what I was saying about the soften. I know that this one has about 2.5 to 3 dBs of play. So if we set this, say for example, down to like minus, let's just say 7 dBs, which was about 3 dBs above minus 10, obviously. And then we soften this. You'll see that the body of the waveform remains quite rounded, while we've cut off quite a large amount of that peak, to the point where we now have variance of only about 4.5 dBs. Okay, so we can reduce the amount of soften to taste and reduce the threshold. That way, reducing the amount of difference between the transient and the body. So you got to be pretty clinical with this. You don't want to like distort that body, because you're going to hear it very audibly. But if you just observe the waveform, you can actually get a lot done in your waveform by just observing. You know, does the waveform distort? No. You're probably fine. So before we clipped it, that sample was actually peaking above 0 at 0.6 dBs. And it had a loudness factor of around minus 17 to minus 18. Here, if we just clip it, you barely even hear that difference. Do you know what I mean? It's just a little bit on the transient. In my opinion, it actually sounds a bit better. Same loudness factor, 5 more dBs till peak. So if we put a tool here, turn it up just below 5 dBs, like 4.5. We've increased the loudness factor of the kick drum without peaking it. Just a clipper, in my opinion, and knowing how it works, knowing what the thresholds are and the peak values, is so much more powerful than having all of the different dynamics processing plugins on the market. Obviously for this task, you know, dynamics processing of drums is a very specific thing, especially of like these kinds of drum sounds. But yeah, with these kinds of things, what I'll do is then I will just render this out. And then just using the gain here, we can actually further shape the sound a little bit. So I like to just kind of reincorporate that scoop just before the body of the sound. Okay, so now to compare. Let's say we had to normalize the kicks so that they're kind of at a competitive peak level. So for example, this one, which was plus 3 dBs, let's put this down to minus 6, and then let's put this down to minus 6. And let's compare them. Remember, these started as exactly the same sound, right? In fact, it was like it was what I would use as a normal kick. And then I just compressed it, and that created the issues. And then we fixed the issues after. It's night and day. It's night and day. And it was so subtle. Each of the steps in the process are subtle. You don't really notice it until it's like, boom, the finished thing. And you're like, that's it. You know, that's it. Subtle, but it makes all the difference for these big punchy kick drums. Yeah, I think that about sums it up for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.